morning, the nation is preparing to mark a day that changed the world, the terror attacks of 9/11 20 years later. Tomorrow will be a day of remembrance and reflection from coast to coast, led by tributes and ceremonies at all three memorial sites. In a moment, Craig will join us from Shanksville, Pennsylvania, but we do start at the site of the World Trade Center here in New York with NBC's senior national correspondent Tom Yamas. Tom, good morning.
Hey, Hoda, good morning to you. We were walking up to this site, and it happens every single time I come here. You just feel something. You start to hear the waterfalls. You see the pool, which was the South Tower, the footprint of the South Tower. And as you get closer, you start to see the names. Juan Ortega Campos, Randall Drake. And then you look up, and you think about that day and all the lives lost, and you remember how everything changed forever.
Nearly 20 years later, the image, the moment, the terror are still hard to believe.
Two airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center.
That attack would include two more hijacked planes, one crashing into the Pentagon, the other in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Nearly 3,000 people would die. On Saturday, President Biden will visit memorials at all three crash sites.
Ruben Esquilin Jr.
Sadie at
the 9/11 Memorial in New York City, family members will continue their tradition, reading aloud the names of those killed. Memorials also planned at the Pentagon to honor the 184 killed, and in Shanksville to honor the passengers and crew who perished.
How often do you think about 9/11?
I think about 9/11 every day. When I wake up, just being able to breathe and to walk.
Retired Port Authority police officer William Jimeno rushed to the World Trade Center as both buildings were burning. Pinned near an elevator shaft, he somehow survived.
We had been crushed, lost 3 teammates, had been burnt from fireballs. I just wanted to die.
30 minutes later, the North Tower came down.
I just held on for dear life, and it sounded like 12 million freight trains coming down on us. And when it stopped, everything went silent and dark.
For 13 hours, William stayed buried, along with his sergeant, John McLaughlin. A team of Marines heard their cries for help, rescuing them. They were among the last people pulled out of the rubble alive.
If we don't find light out of a tragedy, no matter what that tragedy is, it's just a tragedy.
For NYPD officer Erin Coughlin, that light is remembering her father, Sergeant John Coughlin. He ran into the South Tower to rescue others and never came out. And when she puts on the uniform, she's also wearing his police shield.
I don't know if you pray or not, but if you do, have you ever, try to talk to him and tell him, I'm proud of you, I know what you did?
Those moments where you stop and you're like, are you there? Or you just think, Dad, you there? Just stick with us.
And as we look up nearly 20 years later, we hope all of those victims from 9/11 are looking right back down on us. Officer Coughlin wants America to know that there is a new generation of police officers and firefighters, first responders, and if asked, would do the exact same thing the heroes of 9/11 did. Savannah and Hoda.
All right. Thank you so much, Tom.
Craig joins us now from the memorial to the heroes of United Flight 93 in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Craig, good morning to you.
Hey, Savannah, Hoda, good morning to both of you as well. Preparations underway here at the Flight 93 National Memorial in Shanksville to honor the 40 lives that were lost on that flight that tragically crashed here on September 11th. The memorial ceremony will be attended by former President George W. Bush, who's expected to speak and pay his respects, alongside First Lady Laura Bush as well. And they'll do that in front of a small crowd of family members and invited guests. President Biden, First Lady Dr. Jill Biden, also expected to be here as well. And then at 10:03 a.m. precisely, the time of the crash, that annual tradition will continue. The names of the victims will be read, and bells of remembrance will be rung in their memory. And a major theme throughout this ceremony will be the remarkable bravery that was shown by the passengers on that flight in confronting those hijackers, and in doing so, sacrificed their own lives. Of course, as you know, the plane was originally aimed for the Capitol in Washington, D.C., but because of that heroism from those passengers, thousands of lives were likely saved on September 11th. And who can ever forget those words from Todd Beamer? You remember Todd Beamer, the account manager for Oracle, who was headed out to California on a one-day business trip. He said just before they tried wresting control of the plane from the hijackers, "Let's roll." And guys, over my shoulder here at the memorial, you can see the wall of names commemorating those heroes who fought back that day. And tonight, lanterns will be lit and placed, 40 of them alongside that wall. And we should note that right here where I'm standing is of particular importance, because this is where the families of those on board first gathered 20 years ago to remember their loved ones with flowers and flags and candles. In fact, this is a picture from that early makeshift memorial. There is a phrase that is etched on a glass panel here at the memorial that really encapsulates what this memorial means to so many. A common field one day, a field of honor forever.
2 decades later, the events of September 11th and the weeks that followed are etched in all of our memories. For many here at NBC New York, that pain and fear was experienced through the prism of a camera lens as journalists covering the unthinkable. For this special report, News 4 remembers, we asked our reporters and anchors to take us back to the day we'll never forget.
The implications of 9/11 were so vast, the damage so exceptional, the loss so profound. During the course of the first few hours, we were hit twice. The Pentagon was hit. The plane went down in Shanksville. Air travel was suspended, and the entire world came to a screeching halt. Almost 3,000 of our fellow citizens perished.
8:42 a.m. on Election Day in New York City. A hijacked airliner is flown directly into the North Tower of the World Trade Center.
I got a call about a plane hitting the World Trade Center, and my first thought was that it had to be some private pilot. It must be foggy out there. I went to the window and looked out and was shocked that it was this crystalline, autumnal day out there. Visibility unlimited. An alarm bell started going off.
I turned on the TV and our news cut-in was about to come on. And there's always the view of downtown from the top of the rock camera. And so the view is the Empire State Building and Lower Manhattan, and Twin Towers were there. Everything looked perfect. It was a beautiful September day. 15 minutes later, and there was the North Tower on fire.
Beepers at the time went off. It said all crews report to the World Trade Center.
I was on air live that morning, and I remember vividly how crystal blue that sky was that day, and that going into the morning, the big story was the mayoral election and the primaries, and our reporter who was down here for the election started yelling, "Something's just happened, something's just happened. I think something just struck the World Trade Center."
I was a night shift reporter for WNBC, so my in time was, let's say, about 2 o'clock, and a friend of mine who's a police officer in New York City called me and told me that a plane crashed into the World Trade Center. And as a reporter, you know, there's a plane crash, you immediately go. So I started heading down, and when I got to the scene, you really realize the magnitude, that this was the biggest thing and the worst thing we had ever seen up close. We spent the whole day watching it and watching first responders try to get people out, and it was a traumatic experience for everybody, even if you were just a bystander.
At first they thought it was a small plane that hit the building, and what I remember most about it was the person she was interviewing, a witness, was using language that sounded like when the Hindenburg exploded in New Jersey. He was saying, "Oh, the humanity," and it didn't sound real.
Because I had to do my job that day, because I had to sit in front of the camera and try to understand what was happening, ferret out whatever information we could to share with the audience, it may have been easier for me than a lot of people sitting at home helplessly watching and wondering what the next horrible thing was going to be.
This day at 8:42 this morning, September 11th, 2001, became a day that will live in infamy.
The various bits and pieces of knowledge I picked up over the years could be applied on 9/11. what happens when you fly an airliner filled with jet fuel at 500 miles an hour into a structure. I was consumed with that. I think I was able to somewhat compartmentalize my feelings, which were awful. I was watching this happen to my city.
And it was unbelievable. We just couldn't believe what we were seeing. And I remember just thinking, what's happening at the White House? What's happening in New York?
And then the second plane, we knew exactly what was happening.
Oh, another one just hit. Something else just hit, a very large plane.
I saw the plane hit the second tower. Everybody thought it was an explosion, but actually the image I saw was a wide-body jet with large wings, and then it hit the South Tower. And then I screamed. I was like, oh my gosh, we're being attacked. And they're like, you're going on the air. As I saw the image, I walked them through it, and then when they saw what I saw, they realized too.
From what I am looking at on television, from the angle that I was looking.
Here's a replay right here, I believe.
When I was watching looking at the first tower, I noticed that there was a small plane coming around the side of the building. You see it there on the right?
I see it. I see
so
it.
It's coming
I do
down,
see it right there.
There it is, right there.
I see it.
And then it goes boom, right there.
And to this day, 20 years later, I still get people that come up to me and say, I remember you were on the air that day talking about what happened and describing the plane as it hit the South Tower.
When the second plane hit, it was that moment that I realized that we were under attack. Our city was under attack. The nation was under attack.
And immediately in my mind, I started thinking, this is no accident. This has to be terrorism.
We walked over to West Street. As soon as we got onto West Street, we looked south and both buildings were on fire, still standing and on fire. And so what we did was we walked south on West Street, which was at that point closed to cars, and kept walking south to go as close as we could get.
When the second plane hit, then you have that sick feeling in the pit of your stomach, like, you know, this was not right. Something was terribly wrong. I raced in and just started hearing on the radio about the towers beginning to fall. And I remember just sitting there with the taxi driver, this stranger that I didn't know, and we're just sharing this extremely awkward, intimate moment.
I remember seeing smoke, and I remember seeing just those masses of people covered in dust walking north. I remember trying to get closer to get pictures, to get access, and I remember being told, you know, you have to stand back and keep a safe distance.
Out of the area! You have to go this way! Out of the area! Let's go! This is what is coming over our radio. Get out of the area. The second tower is coming down.
The president's on the move. Mayor Giuliani at the time was very visible, which was reassuring to the city, and the only source of information.
All that we know right now is that 2 airplanes struck the 2 large towers of the World Trade Center. We spoke to the White House. There also apparently was an attack on the Pentagon.
I remember seeing Mayor Giuliani later that day, and I remember him saying something to the effect of, the casualties are going to be more than anyone can really bear. I remember walking around the perimeter with the governor, with Fire Commissioner Tom Van Essen at various points. I remember he was so emotional. He had lost 343 members, but of course we didn't know what the numbers were yet.
I certainly will never erase the image of the video we didn't show, which was people jumping, people so desperate at the tower, trapped. They'd come to work that day, a normal work day, and now suddenly they were at a moment where they had to make an awful decision. That will certainly live with me for a long time.
You remember moments, parades of people walking uptown, covered in dust, and at the same time, the pizza place open for business and serving people. There was this strange parallel universe between New York City working, the city that doesn't sleep or stop, and life having halted.
If you have plans to come into New York City today, you must cancel them. The city is literally shut down.
I was there, watched it collapse with my own eyes.
And there are police trying to evacuate the area as quickly as possible.
I remember interviewing a firefighter who said that his other unit went inside. And I remember asking him something like, what happened to them, or where did they get to? And he shook his head and he said, I don't know.
We went to LaGuardia Airport, and the images that stay with me is of just a tremendous crowd of people being herded out of all the buildings into the parking lots, into the streets, police officers with long guns running around. There was just a chaos to it, a feeling of what's next.
I'll never forget, there were cars that literally stopped on the turnpike, not on the shoulder, not haphazard. People just pulled over, stopped their cars, and they're staring at the Manhattan skyline, and the South Tower starts coming down.
Doing the best that we can to evacuate southern Manhattan below Canal Street.
My attention turned to those first boats that were coming across the river from lower Manhattan, and people, just gray people. You didn't know if they were black, white, male, female. Everybody was just covered in gray dust. And some of them, you could only see their eyes. They were pouring water still on their faces. They had bandages on their heads. Some were holding broken arms that were covered in blood. And ferries and tugboats and fishing boats and tourist boats. And I'm like, they just one after another, after another, after another, and people scrambling out. And some of them, you know, medics were helping them out. There was never a plan to evacuate lower Manhattan by boat. They just wanted to get away from the smoke and the fire and the fear and the terror. There were probably 100, 200,000 people that these boats brought over. A full state of emergency has been declared here in Jersey City. In this area of Exchange Place, all these buildings have been evacuated, and this area has been transformed into a virtual triage center. I was on the air at that point, and we have to let people know, because the parents didn't know where their kids were. These teachers just got these kids on a boat and got them out of the city.
Nothing could prepare you for seeing those towers in a pile of rubble. Nothing could prepare you for seeing that up close, because you knew so many people were gone.
I was at JFK, which was a silent ghost town.
I saw it. We all saw it. Manhattan was so quiet.
The city outside, it's eerie how quiet it is around here.
Quiet eeriness of the city. Had never felt that or experienced it. Even in the first World Trade Center attack, it was not like that. We had never experienced that. It's eeriness in the city, followed quickly by military trucks and military personnel at intersections we knew all too well.
I was assigned to go to St. Vincent's Hospital, which was where they had set up a trauma care unit on the street outside the hospital. And the thought was that this would be one of the places that would receive patients.
We've seen a couple of ambulances come in. They're obviously preparing for people to be brought here.
I do remember there were very few, but a couple of ambulances that came to bring patients who had been injured. And I remember, I don't know how or why I would have thought this, but I remember the ambulance doors opening in the very beginning and it looking like there was smoke coming out of the ambulances. It was really that dust. In the beginning, there were a couple of patients, but then that changed. And what became more newsworthy was the fact that there were no patients coming. And so that was one of the first moments where I remember realizing the enormity of it.
People were coming to try to get information about their families. Our news vans started to get filled with posters from people who were trying to find their family members.
They had set up a family assistance center at the Armory on Lexington Avenue. And we spent a couple of days there, and what would happen is family members who had someone missing would come over to you with their loved one's photo and say, can you please help me? Can you put my daughter, my son, my husband on TV in case anyone has seen them? And they were holding out hope. There were parents who flew in from other states looking for their kids, who came to work in New York City. There were so many people that you want to hug them and you want to cry. And as a reporter, you say to yourself, you better not cry. If she's not crying, you don't cry. We don't have the right, you know. There was one woman in particular, she came over to me and her name was Evelyn. She was just looking for her husband, and he was not found. And as it turned out, he was an EMT who had gone back and forth into that building several times to save people. And on his last trip, he didn't make it out. And I think of her all the time.
They had the faces of the missing posted on walls all around the building, and it just gave you a sense of what was lost here.
I remember seeing those pages just covering the walls and thinking about how they represented the desperation of those family members who still had hope. And it's one of the most astonishing and upsetting things that I have ever seen.
They do have a plan that they're hoping will help some families to get some better information.
I interviewed the family members in desperation, saying, if you see or hear anyone, let me know. Now, understand, a grim reality started settling in pretty quickly. We knew that very few people were going to emerge.
We're live on the air, we're interviewing people, and people are giving their home telephone numbers. You would never think to do that. You don't want to have your personal privacy put out there like that, but people were just so desperate.
All of these families are there and they're desperate. I mean, they are just looking for a shred of evidence that maybe their loved one survived.
The next day, I remember so vividly, the ironworkers parading down the West Side Highway in front of us like a conquering army. And they were waving American flags and they were carrying their toolboxes, and people were standing by cheering them on. It was just a moment of solidarity that I'll never forget.
There was no traffic on the West Side Highway, but at one point, you know, while I'm reporting, all of a sudden there are vehicles coming down the West Side Highway headed south. And it's ambulances and fire trucks and, you know, police vans from all over the country. I mean, I'm not talking about New Jersey and Pennsylvania. You know, I'm talking about Florida and Georgia and, you know, places in the Midwest. And these emergency services vehicles have driven overnight and are now going down to the disaster to see if there's anything they can do.
We were able to get in and shoot video of the pile and the buckets of rubble that firefighters and police officers and first responders were passing back and forth, and the silence when they would tell everybody to be quiet because they wanted to know if they could hear anything or hear anyone.
I just saw them digging and committed, and you know, they ran in when everybody else ran out.
In those hours and days after that, being so filled with pride that the city came together like it did. You know, lines around the block to donate blood, people bringing food down to the pile, people showing up at the police department and the fire department simply to say thank you.
The biggest image for me, being a weather person, a meteorologist, was probably the smoke plume from the pile. You know, the weather pattern that day and subsequently for many days after was a very stable weather pattern. So the smoke didn't really rise all the way up. It sort of stayed on top of us.
And I remember more so the smell of the smoke for days, for weeks afterwards.
You could smell it in the air for weeks, if not months, kind of taste it.
One word to describe Newark Airport for those 4 days: empty. But one of the most impactful moments of my life and professional career came on Friday night. After the attack, around the world, people were gathering in solidarity with the United States. And out came all of the flight attendants, gate agents, clerks, baggage handlers, whoever was working for the international airlines, holding candles, singing America the Beautiful.
God bless America, my home sweet home. USA! USA!
And I remember a restaurant near Ground Zero that was serving food to the first responders who were working down there, and people were filing in and out. There was also a gas station down the road from the Trade Center where they were handing out water. There were people gathered there that were just average citizens who were trying to comfort the first responders as they went in and out from the location.
It was a story I did much later about a young man who had been quite heroic. He lost his life. His name was Wells Crowther. He was the man in the red bandana. He lost his own life, but he saved a lot of people from dying, led them out of what was certain death to safety.
There was a real sense of appreciation in the city for all the people who stepped up to help. And, you know, I don't think that we could have gotten through it without all that help.
I think the camaraderie and the sense of support and the sense of caring and the sense of love and we're in this together was very real.
We clearly could see the first responders going in. I remember the steady stream, and there was no thought on their minds of the safety. It was clawing away. And they all streamed in, and volunteers came from around the country to get in there.
So many of them were so heroic, but I just suddenly began thinking about the succession of funerals for the 343 firefighters who died, and the police officers who died, gave their lives trying to rescue others.
In subsequent days and months, the funerals, St. Patrick's, churches, sound of taps, it was endless.
My dad was a battalion chief in the FDNY, and he had retired shortly before 9/11. And he'd been very active in the department, and he knew a lot of the names you see behind me, 343. In the weeks and the months that followed, a lot of the retirees, a lot of the volunteer fire departments on Long Island, they went to months and months of funerals. Normally, there's a line of duty death, and the entire department, practically the entire department comes. That just wasn't possible, given how many there were. And so a lot of the retirees, a lot of the volunteer departments out there came and did their very best to show up in numbers and to show the families that they were loved and respected.
In the weeks and months that followed 9/11, the sadness just never went away. I remember the holidays that year was just, it felt wrong.
The one memory that I have that's really hard was weeks later, the 9/11 dispatchers had a news conference, and one of them was speaking and saying that they were telling callers to just stay put because the firefighters would get to you. And she said, and then they didn't come. And there was just this agonizing moment at this news conference. Her look was so one of anguish and pain. And I just blurted out, well, you know, it wasn't your fault and you couldn't have done anything. And she said, yes, I know, but I think the guilt was just so overwhelming for them. I just couldn't help it. It was just, she was in such pain, and I wanted her to know that we all knew that they did the best that they could.
We know so many people died, you hear the names, but then when you meet the family members and you see how this is going to change their family forever, there's this moment of respect that you want to give that person. And so in that sense, it was nice to be able to try to tell their story so that people would know who they were and what they contributed.
We'd hear those names and the familiar cadence and the familiar ritual, the moments of silence, the chime of the bell. And so when you come here, for me, it starts to echo. I see the names and it starts to hear that silence that comes, but it's also very soothing and calming.
It's difficult to believe it's been 20 years. It seems, many times it seems like yesterday when we were suddenly shocked by what had happened.
I can't believe it's been 20 years. It still feels as sad and heavy, I think, as it has every year. I know that for the families and the people who lost someone, it's probably like yesterday. And I think you feel that being here.
Whenever we would drive into the city, approaching the Lincoln Tunnel around the Helix, you would always see them standing there. And when you didn't see them, it just made you sad, and it made you remember that day. And it was like a death in your family.
The memorial is called Reflecting Absence, and it's intentionally minimalistic with the names, the reflecting pools.
Whenever I come downtown, I drive by, I've stopped by, you look into the chasm, you look at the names, they were all of us.
You remember
that each name is a person and a family and a story.
In the days after 9/11, there was the Long Island community of Rockville Center was hit really hard, and we sat down with a group of men who had lost family members, and I've remained friends with them for the last 20 years. I see them on the anniversaries, and we share, you know, milestones. Such a strange situation to have created friendships out of this tragedy.
I look at those names, and each of those names had an incredible story, and their loss was shattering. How do we tell this history 20 years from now, so that they're not just engraved names, a site for people to visit, so it has meaning?
As a human being, it certainly made me appreciate everything that we sometimes take for granted.
When this happened, everybody felt wounded, everybody, and you feel it when you come here.
There were no strangers in New York after 9/11. We all hug each other in the streets, we help each other if we could, and gratified by the tribute in light. When I saw those twin beams of light rising out of the heavens, that represented the towers, and it represented all those souls lost. Beautiful.